The cigarette tip glowed red in the alley darkness, casting devil shadows on brick walls, slick with grease and rot. Copper Creek's back alleys reeked of piss and broken dreams, where decent folks never ventured after the sun died behind the mountains. The man's thick fingers, stained yellow from years of tobacco, rolled the burning ember closer to pale skin that had already known too much pain. She didn't flinch. 12 years old, maybe 13, kneeling in mud that squelched between her bare toes, and she didn't make a sound. Just knelt there beside scattered potatoes like they were golden coins. Her small hands frozen in the act of gathering what little food she could salvage from the dirt. "Are you going to put out the cigarette on me?" Lucy's voice carried no hope, no plea, just the flat acceptance of someone who'd learned that screaming only brought more pain, that begging only made the monsters hungrier. Inside the Golden Nugget Saloon, Nathan Cross set down his whiskey glass with a sharp crack against scarred wood. The amber liquid forgotten ripples spreading outward like shock waves. Something cold and metallic twisted in his chest, tasting of gunpowder and old blood. He'd heard that tone before, in field hospitals where boys called for their mothers with their guts spilling onto sawdust floors. In dying men who'd given up hope of seeing another sunrise. But this was a child. The saloon's noise crashed over him. Drunken laughter, off-key piano, the clink of coins changing hands over cards that were probably marked. Smoke hung thick as fog, mixing tobacco with the stench of unwashed bodies and spilled liquor. But cutting through it all sharp as a cavalry saber came that small voice from the alley behind the building. Nathan pushed back from his table, ignoring the curious glances from other patrons. Men with dead eyes and quick hands, the kind who asked no questions because they had secrets of their own. The bartender, a grizzled bull, with arms like tree trunks and scars mapping his knuckles, caught Nathan's eye and shook his head. "Best to mind your own business, stranger." He didn't pause in his methodical polishing of a glass that would never be truly clean. Some things in this town ain't worth the trouble they bring. But Nathan had learned long ago that the things worth doing were often the most troublesome. And that voice belonged to someone who needed help, whether she knew it or not. He pushed through the saloon's back door hinges screaming like wounded animals, stepped into an alley where garbage rotted in piles high as a man's waist, where human misery hung in the air, thick as smoke from a prairie fire. The smell hit him first. Rotting meat, stale urine, and underneath it all the copper tang of old blood. The scene that greeted him stopped him cold, freezing his blood in veins that had carried him through Antietam and Gettysburg. A girl knelt in mud beside an overturned bucket, her small hands frantically trying to gather scattered potatoes, while tears carved clean tracks through the grime, coating her hollow cheeks. She was painfully thin ribs, showing through a dress that was little more than rags held together by hope and desperation. Her hair once auburn, but now matted with dirt, and what looked like dried blood hung in tangled curtains around shoulders that shook with cold and exhaustion. But it wasn't her poverty that made Nathan's blood run cold. It was the man standing over her, built like a bull, with shoulders that strained against his dirty shirt, and hands that looked capable of crushing bone. The stepfather swayed with drink, but his intent was crystal clear. His face was flushed red with alcohol, and something darker, meaner. The kind of cruelty that came not from necessity, but from pleasure in another's pain. A lit cigarette danced between fat fingers, like the eye of a demon trailing smoke that mixed with his whiskey-thick breath. "Clumsy little wretch," he snarled, words slurred but vicious. "Maybe a little fire will teach you to be more careful with other people's property." This, Nathan realized with growing horror, must be the stepfather he'd heard whispered about in the saloon's darker corners. The man who'd inherited a child when he married her mother, who saw that inheritance as property to be used or discarded as he saw fit. The girl had stopped gathering potatoes, was looking up at the monster with eyes that held no hope, only the weary acceptance of someone who had endured this torment many times before. Her lips cracked and bleeding barely moved as she spoke. "Please don't," she whispered. "I'll be more careful. I promise I'll be more careful." The stepfather's laugh was ugly harsh, as crows cawing over carrion. "Promises from you ain't worth the breath they're spoke with. You need lessons that stick, lessons that leave marks." He brought the cigarette closer to her cheek. She closed her eyes, bracing for pain that would burn and fester and remind her for weeks of her place in his world. Nathan's hand found his Colt .45 fingers, wrapping around the worn grip with muscle memory from 1,000 battles. The weight of the iron felt familiar, comforting, like greeting an old friend who'd never let him down. "I don't think that's going to happen," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in battle, that had kept boys from breaking when the world exploded around them in fire and lead. The stepfather spun around, swaying as alcohol fought against rage for control of his thick body. Up close, Nathan could see the network of broken blood vessels across his nose and cheeks, the yellow stains on teeth that had never known proper care, and most importantly, the coward's fear that flickered in bloodshot eyes when he realized he was facing someone his own size. "This ain't none of your concern, stranger," he growled, but Nathan could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice like rot spreading through timber. "The girl's mine to discipline as I see fit." "Is that what you call it?" Nathan took a step closer, boots squelching in mud, mixed with things he didn't want to identify. "Burning children, where I come from, we have a different name for men who hurt little girls." The girl had scrambled backward against the alley wall, still clutching those rescued potatoes to her chest, like precious gems. Her eyes darted between the two men, wide and unblinking, like a cornered animal, trying to decide which predator posed the greater threat. For a moment, the alley fell silent, except for the distant sound of laughter from the saloon and the girl's quiet, ragged breathing. Nathan could hear his own heartbeat steady and calm, despite the violence that hung in the air, thick as fog. The same coldness that had kept him alive through hell itself settled over him like an old coat. The stepfather's hand moved toward the knife at his belt, and Nathan saw the motion before it was halfway complete. Read the intent in the man's eyes, in the tensing of his shoulders, in the shift of his weight from one foot to the other. "You best walk away," the stepfather said, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fear he was trying so desperately to hide. "This is family business. Can't do that." Nathan's voice was quiet, conversational, like discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "Some lines, once you cross them, change a man forever. And I already stepped over this one the moment I heard that little girl's voice." What followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity, stretched thin as wire. The stepfather lunged forward with his knife moving with the clumsy aggression of a drunk bully who had never faced real opposition, who had built his reputation terrorizing those weaker than himself. Nathan sidestepped the wild swing, like he was dancing muscle memory from countless battles guiding his movements. The blade whistled past his ear close enough to part his hair, but never close enough to draw blood. He brought his knee up hard into the man's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in an explosive whoosh that echoed off the alley walls. As the stepfather doubled over, gasping and retching, Nathan relieved him of his knife with practiced ease, sent it clattering into the darkness beyond the lamplight, where it rang against brick like a bell, tolling for the dead. "Stay down," Nathan advised, watching as the man writhed in the dirt, clutching his stomach like he was trying to hold his guts inside his body. "And if I hear you've laid another hand on her, I'll come back and finish what we started here tonight." The threat hung in the air between them, solid as a hangman's noose. Both men knew Nathan meant every word. The stepfather's eyes, watering from pain and humiliation, burned with hatred, but also with the knowledge that he'd been beaten by a better man. Only then did Nathan turn his attention to the girl who was watching the entire scene, with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. She was beautiful, in the way that wildflowers growing through cracks in stone are beautiful. Delicate and precious precisely because of the harsh conditions that should have crushed her spirit, but somehow hadn't. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crouching down to her level and keeping his voice as gentle as he could manage. This close, he could see the full extent of her suffering. The hollow cheeks that spoke of chronic hunger, the bruises on her wrists that told of previous violence, and most heartbreaking of all, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly. She shook her head, mutely, still clutching those precious potatoes. In the lamplight spilling from the saloon's back window, he could see that her hair had once been beautiful, a rich auburn color that caught light, like burnished copper. Her dress, patched and repatched with whatever scraps of cloth she could find, had probably once belonged to her mother. A woman Nathan was beginning to understand had been this child's only protector in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. "What's your name?" he asked, settling back on his heels to make himself less threatening. "Lucy," she whispered. And then, as if the name itself was dangerous, she glanced quickly at her stepfather, who was slowly struggling to his feet, while glaring at both of them with undisguised hatred. "Well, Lucy, I'm Nathan," he said, making sure to smile despite the rage still burning in his chest like a banked fire. "And I think maybe you and I should have a talk." The stepfather spat blood into the dirt and wiped more from his split lip with the back of his hand. "She comes home with me," he snarled, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore, just the empty bluster of a beaten dog. "She's my responsibility. Your responsibility." Nathan stood slowly, letting his full height remind everyone present exactly who had won their brief encounter. At 6 feet and 2 inches of frontier-hardened muscle, he made an imposing figure, even in the dim light. "The way I see it, you forfeited any claim to responsibility when you decided to use a lit cigarette as a teaching tool." The stepfather opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it when he saw Nathan's hand drift back toward his gun. Instead, he backed away, pointing a shaking finger at Lucy, like he was casting a curse. "You come home when you're ready to behave," he said, but they all knew it was the empty threat of a beaten man. "And don't think this stranger's going to be around to protect you forever." With that, he stumbled away into the darkness, leaving Lucy and Nathan alone in the alley, with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the distant piano music from the saloon. Nathan watched until he was certain the man was truly gone, then turned back to the girl, who was still crouched against the wall like a frightened animal. "Lucy," he said softly, "when was the last time you had a proper meal?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. Her eyes, he noticed, were a remarkable shade of green, like deep forest pools reflecting sunlight. Finally, she shrugged a gesture that tried to appear casual, but couldn't hide the profound sadness behind it. "I eat," she said, but the way she said it told Nathan everything he needed to know about the quality and quantity of those meals. "Would you like to join me for dinner?" he asked. "There's a boarding house down the street that serves decent food, and I could use the company." For the first time since he had met her, something resembling hope flickered in Lucy's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by wariness born of too many disappointments, and she shook her head. "He'll be angry if I don't come home," she said, though they both knew that her stepfather would be angry regardless of what she did. His rage was like a storm that struck without warning or reason. "Let me worry about him," Nathan said, extending his hand to help her up. "Tonight you're going to eat a real meal and sleep in a real bed. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." She stared at his outstretched hand for what felt like forever, and Nathan could see the internal battle playing out across her young features. Trust did not come easily to someone who had learned that the people supposed to protect her were often the source of her greatest pain. But hunger and exhaustion were powerful motivators, and finally, tentatively, she reached out and placed her small, dirt-stained hand in his. The touch sent a shock through Nathan's system. Not romantic, but something deeper and more primal. It was the touch of someone reaching out for salvation, and he knew in that moment that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As Nathan helped Lucy to her feet, he made a silent promise that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe, even if it meant confronting demons far worse than one drunken stepfather. Her hand in his felt fragile as bird bones, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Survivor's strength. "Come on," he said gently, guiding her toward the street. "Let's get you fed." The boarding house was run by a kindly widow named Mrs. Patterson, a woman whose soft gray hair and gentle eyes spoke of someone who had known loss but refused to let it make her bitter. She took one look at Lucy and immediately began bustling around, preparing a plate of beef stew and fresh bread that made the girl's eyes widen with hunger and disbelief. "Poor lamb," Mrs. Patterson murmured, setting the steaming bowl in front of Lucy with hands that shook slightly with age and emotion. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Lucy didn't answer, too focused on the food before her. She ate with the desperate intensity of someone who had known real hunger, who couldn't be sure when the next meal might come. Every bite was precious, savored, even as she struggled not to eat too fast and make herself sick. Nathan watched her eat, and with each spoonful, he felt his resolve hardening like steel tempered in fire. No child should have to eat like that with the frantic urgency of starvation. No child should flinch every time a door opened or footsteps approached. Mrs. Patterson pulled Nathan aside while Lucy continued eating. "That child's been coming around here for weeks," she whispered, her voice tight with concern. "Doing odd jobs for scraps of food. Says her stepfather don't provide much. But it's worse than that, ain't it?" Nathan nodded grimly. "Much worse. I figured as much. Seen the bruises when she thought nobody was looking. Heard her coughing something fierce, too." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "Sounds like the same cough that took my Henry 5 years back." Consumption. The word hung unspoken between them, heavy as a death sentence. Nathan had heard that cough before, had watched it claim his beloved Catherine inch by agonizing inch. The wet, harsh sound that meant lungs were drowning in their own blood. "How bad is it?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Bad enough that she shouldn't be sleeping in some cold shack with a man who don't care if she lives or dies," Mrs. Patterson said. "Child needs proper care, proper food, proper medicine, things her stepfather ain't likely to provide." As if summoned by their conversation, Lucy began coughing, not the gentle clearing of a throat, but the deep racking spasms that shook her entire body. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, and when she pulled it away, Nathan could see the bright red stains that confirmed his worst fears. Mrs. Patterson was beside her in an instant, rubbing her back and speaking in soothing tones. "Easy, child. Just breathe slow and steady. It'll pass." When the coughing fit finally subsided, Lucy looked up at Nathan with embarrassment burning in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I know it sounds awful." "Don't apologize for being sick," Nathan said, settling into the chair across from her. "That ain't your fault any more than having blue eyes or brown hair is your fault." Over the next hour, as Lucy finished her meal and Mrs. Patterson fussed over her, like the grandmother she'd never been allowed to be, Nathan learned more about the girl's situation. Her mother, Margaret, had died 6 months earlier from what the town doctor diplomatically called complications from a fall down the stairs. But the way Mrs. Patterson's eyes darkened when she spoke of it, the way her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, told a different story entirely. "Margaret was a good woman," Mrs. Patterson said, watching as Lucy nodded off in her chair, exhaustion finally claiming her. "Did her best to shield that child from her husband's drinking and violence. But after she lost her job at the copper mine and the gambling debts started piling up, she trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air like gun smoke." "He killed her," Nathan said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "Can't prove it, and Sheriff Morrison ain't inclined to ask too many questions. But Margaret had bruises on her arms and back that looked like finger marks, and she'd been asking around about places she and Lucy could go, ways they could get away from him. The picture was becoming clearer, painted in shades of violence and desperation that Nathan knew all too well. A woman trapped with an increasingly unstable man trying to protect her child while planning their escape. A plan that had cost her everything. "What about Lucy?" Nathan asked. "How's she survived this long?" "Keeps her head down, does what she's told, tries to be invisible," Mrs. Patterson replied. "But he's getting worse. Drinking more, gambling, more, losing more. And when he loses, he takes it out on her. Child's covered in bruises that ain't from falling downstairs." That night, Nathan arranged for Lucy to stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson had a small room under the eaves that she normally rented to traveling preachers and school teachers, people of modest means, but good character. She refused to take any money for it. "Child needs safety more than I need coin," she said firmly. "Besides, it'll do my old heart good to have someone to fuss over again." As Nathan tucked Lucy into a real bed with clean sheets and warm blankets, she grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "You won't leave, will you?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "You won't go away like everyone else?" The question hit Nathan like a physical blow. This child had lost everyone who had ever mattered to her, had learned that people disappeared from her life without warning or explanation. Her fear of abandonment was as real and immediate as her fear of violence. "I'll be right downstairs," he promised, "and I'll be here in the morning when you wake up." She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she finally relaxed and closed her eyes. But even as she drifted off to sleep, Nathan could hear the rattling in her chest, the harsh breathing that spoke of lungs fighting a losing battle against disease. Time was running out for Lucy, and they both knew it. 3 days had passed since that night in the alley, and Copper Creek had begun to feel less like a temporary stop, and more like a battleground where the future would be decided. Nathan had spent those days learning everything he could about Lucy's situation, and what he discovered made his blood run cold with a fury that he struggled to contain. Lucy came to the boarding house each morning under the pretense of doing odd jobs for Mrs. Patterson. But Nathan could see the truth in the careful way she moved, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, and most heartbreaking of all, the way she seemed surprised each time someone showed her basic human kindness. She was like a wild animal that had been beaten so often it could no longer trust the hand that offered food. It was on the 4th morning, as Nathan sat on the boarding house porch, drinking coffee, and watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson, that Lucy approached him with something he had never seen before in her young face determination. "Mr. Nathan," she said, settling onto the step beside him with a grace that reminded him painfully of her mother, whom he had never met, but could envision in every gentle gesture her daughter made. "I need to tell you something." Nathan set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention. Over the past few days, they had developed an easy rapport built on mutual respect, and on his part, a growing paternal affection that filled a hollow space he hadn't even realized existed in his heart. "I'm listening," he said, and meant it. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains as if gathering courage from their ancient strength. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words hit Nathan like physical blows. "My mama didn't fall down the stairs," she said. "He pushed her. I saw it happen." The coffee cup slipped from Nathan's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the porch boards, but he barely noticed. All of his attention was focused on this brave little girl, who was finally finding the strength to speak a truth that had been poisoning her soul for months. "Lucy," he began, but she shook her head and continued as if she knew that stopping now would mean never finding the courage to speak again. "She was trying to protect me," Lucy said, and now the tears were flowing freely down her cheeks. "He came home drunk and angry because he'd lost money gambling, and he was going to hurt me the way he hurt her." She broke off sobbing, and without thinking, Nathan pulled her against his chest, feeling her small body shake with the force of grief and trauma that no child should ever have to carry. As he held her, Nathan felt something fundamental shift inside him. A cold, implacable resolve that went beyond mere anger into something far more dangerous. This wasn't just about protecting one little girl anymore. This was about justice for a woman who had died trying to save her daughter, about making sure that no other child would suffer at this monster's hands. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff?" Nathan asked when Lucy's tears had subsided enough for her to speak. Lucy pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held a cynicism no 12-year-old should possess. "Sheriff Morrison owes my stepfather money from poker games. Besides, who's going to believe a little girl over a grown man?" The truth of her words was like a knife to the heart. In towns like Copper Creek, justice was often a commodity to be bought and sold, and children had no currency with which to purchase it. "Lucy," Nathan said, taking her hands in his and looking directly into her eyes. "What if I told you there was a way out? A way to leave all of this behind and start fresh somewhere new?" Hope flickered in her gaze, but it was tempered by wariness born of too many disappointments. "What do you mean?" "I mean we could leave together. I could take you somewhere safe, somewhere you'd never have to see him again." For a moment, Nathan saw the child she should have been. Excited, hopeful, ready to believe in the possibility of happiness. But then reality crashed back in, and she shook her head. "He'd never let me go," she said. "And even if we got away, he'd come after us. He's told me 100 times that I'm his property, now that I belong to him, until I'm old enough to marry or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Nathan understood exactly what kind of future her stepfather had planned for her. "What if he couldn't come after us?" Nathan asked carefully. "What if we made sure of that?" Lucy studied his face with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. "You mean kill him?" The blunt question caught Nathan off guard, and he realized that this child had been forced to think about things that should never enter a young mind. But there was no judgment in her voice, only a practical assessment of options that spoke to just how desperate her situation had become. "I mean, we make sure you're safe," Nathan said. "Whatever that takes." They sat in silence for a while, watching the town come to life as shopkeepers opened their doors and early risers began their daily routines. It was a peaceful scene that belied the darkness lurking beneath Copper Creek's surface, and Nathan found himself thinking about all the towns like this scattered across the frontier. Places where law and order were suggestions rather than guarantees, where the strong preyed on the weak, and justice was a luxury few could afford. "There's something else," Lucy said suddenly, her voice so quiet Nathan had to lean closer to hear. "Something I haven't told you." Nathan waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be significant. "I'm sick," she said, and the simple word sent ice through his veins. "I've been coughing up blood for weeks now, and sometimes I can barely breathe. Mrs. Patterson thinks it might be consumption." Consumption. The word tasted like ashes in Nathan's mouth. Tuberculosis was a death sentence on the frontier where medical care was primitive, and sanatoriums were a luxury reserved for the wealthy. He had watched it claim his beloved Catherine had seen how it slowly and mercilessly consumed her from within, turning a vibrant, beautiful woman into a shadow of herself, before finally granting her the mercy of death. "How long?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The doctor in town won't see me without payment," she said. "But Mrs. Patterson's husband died of the same thing, and she says maybe 6 months if I'm lucky. 6 months. Half a year for this brave, beautiful child to live whatever life she could manage before the disease claimed her. The injustice of it, the sheer cosmic unfairness, threatened to overwhelm Nathan. She had already lost. Her mother was trapped with a monster who saw her as property. And now she was facing her own mortality, with a courage that humbled him. But then, Nathan thought about Catherine, how she had faced her own diagnosis with grace and determination, how she had made every remaining day count for something. And he realized that Lucy deserved the same chance. Not to live forever, perhaps, but to live freely, to experience kindness and safety, and maybe even happiness in whatever time she had left. "Then we don't have time to waste," Nathan said, standing and extending his hand to her. "Pack whatever you want to take with you. We're leaving tonight." Tonight? Lucy looked up at him with wide eyes that reflected both hope and terror. California. Nathan said, his mind already racing ahead to plan their escape. "I know a place near the coast where the air is clean, and there are doctors who specialize in lung ailments. We'll find you a family to stay with, good people who will take care of you." "What about you?" she asked, and the question caught Nathan off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead, had been so focused on getting her to safety that he hadn't considered his own future beyond that goal. But looking at her now, seeing the hope and trust in her eyes, he knew that his wandering days were over. Whatever happened next, his path was tied to hers. "I'll stay close," he promised. "Make sure you're safe and happy." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, and Nathan could see her weighing options, calculating risks, trying to determine if this wild plan had any chance of success. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "But we have to be careful. If he catches us—" "He won't," Nathan said with more confidence than he felt. "Trust me." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and Copper Creek settled into its nightly routine of drinking and gambling and general lawlessness, Nathan made his final preparations. He had purchased supplies for the journey, food, water, blankets, and medicine for Lucy's cough. His horse was strong and fast, and he had arranged for a second mount through a discreet conversation with the livery stable owner, who asked no questions, as long as the money was good. Lucy met him at the appointed place, an abandoned line shack about a mile outside of town, carrying a small bundle that contained what few possessions she wanted to keep. In the moonlight, she looked like a ghost, pale and ethereal, and Nathan was struck again by how fragile she appeared and how strong she actually was. "Ready?" he asked, helping her onto her horse. She nodded, though Nathan could see the fear in her eyes. Leaving was a gamble, and they both knew it. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. But staying meant certain death for Lucy, whether from her stepfather's violence or from the consumption that was slowly claiming her lungs. They rode in silence for the first hour, keeping to back trails and avoiding the main roads where they might encounter other travelers. The desert night was beautiful, but treacherous, full of hidden dangers and sudden drop-offs that could end their journey before it properly began. But Nathan's horse knew these trails, and Lucy proved to be a natural rider despite her illness. It was as they paused to rest the horses by a small stream that Lucy finally spoke. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Nathan replied. "We have a long way to go." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I mean for treating me like I matter. My mama used to do that, but after she died, no one cared if I lived or died, except to be angry about it." Her words hit Nathan like a physical blow, and he felt tears sting his eyes for the first time since Catherine's funeral. This child had been so starved for basic human kindness that simple decency seemed like a miracle to her. "You do matter," he said fiercely. "You matter more than you know." As they prepared to resume their journey, Lucy suddenly doubled over with a coughing fit that sent blood spattering across the moonlit ground. Nathan held her until the spasms passed, feeling her small body shake with the effort of drawing breath, and he knew that their time was running out faster than he had hoped. "I'm sorry," she gasped when she could finally speak. "Don't be sorry," Nathan said. "Just hold on. We're going to get you somewhere safe, somewhere you can rest and get better." Even as he said the words, Nathan knew they were likely lies. Consumption was rarely curable, especially in cases as advanced as Lucy's appeared to be. But sometimes lies were kinder than truth, and if hope was all he could give her, then he would give it freely. They rode through the night, two fugitives fleeing toward an uncertain future, bound together by circumstance and mutual need. Behind them lay everything dark and terrible about the frontier violence, injustice, and the casual cruelty of those who preyed on the innocent. Ahead lay the promise of something better, even if that promise came with its own set of challenges and heartbreaks. The pursuit began at dawn. Nathan first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon as they crested a ridge that gave them a view of the trail behind them. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving fast, and with purpose. Even at this distance he could make out the bulk of the lead rider, and his heart sank as he recognized the unmistakable silhouette of Lucy's stepfather. "We have company," he told Lucy, who immediately straightened in her saddle despite her exhaustion. She looked back at the approaching riders, and Nathan saw something change in her face. Not fear exactly, but a hardening of resolve that reminded him of soldiers preparing for battle. "He brought help," she said matter-of-factly. "Probably promised them money he doesn't have, or whiskey he can't afford. But they'll come after us anyway because men like that don't like being shown up by strangers." Nathan spurred his horse forward, and Lucy followed without complaint. They had perhaps an hour's head start, maybe less, and the terrain ahead was rough and unforgiving. But it was also familiar to Nathan, who had spent years wandering these trails, and he knew shortcuts that might give them an advantage. The chase stretched on through the morning and into the afternoon, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in the American West. Nathan pushed their horses as hard as he dared, but Lucy's condition was worsening with each jarring stride. Her face had taken on a grayish pallor, and blood flecked her lips more frequently. They reached Willow Springs just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The small trading post squatted in a valley between 2 ridges, offering the promise of rest and resupply for weary travelers. But Nathan knew they couldn't stay long. Their pursuers were closing the distance, and every minute they spent here increased the risk of capture. The inn at Willow Springs was run by an elderly German couple, Hinrich and Greta Zimmerman, who took one look at Lucy's condition and immediately began fussing over her with the kind of maternal concern that she had been denied for too long. Greta insisted on preparing a special broth that she claimed would help with lung ailments, while Hinrich quietly assured Nathan that their establishment was known for its discretion regarding guests who preferred not to discuss their business. But their sanctuary was short-lived. As Lucy slept in a clean bed for the first time in months, Hinrich approached Nathan with grave news. 3 men came through here this morning, he said, his voice heavy with concern, asking questions about a man and a girl traveling together. They offered good money for information. Nathan's blood turned to ice. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, of course," Hinrich replied. "But they will return, and they will search every building if necessary. You cannot stay here." The impossible choice loomed before Nathan once again. Lucy needed rest and medical attention, but staying meant risking capture. Running meant pushing her past her physical limits and possibly hastening her death. Either way, he felt like he was failing her. When he went to wake Lucy, he found her sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. She looked ethereal in the afternoon light, like something painted by an artist who understood that beauty and tragedy were often inseparable. "We have to go, don't we?" she asked without turning around. "How did you know?" "I heard voices downstairs. He found us, didn't he?" There was no point in lying to her. Lucy had lived through too much to be comforted by false reassurances, and she deserved the truth, however painful it might be. "He's close," Nathan admitted. "But we can still get away. We just need to keep moving." She turned to look at him then, and Nathan was struck by how much older she seemed than when they had first met. The innocence that should have been her birthright had been stripped away by circumstances beyond her control, leaving behind a wisdom that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Nathan," she said, using his name with the kind of familiarity that spoke to the bond they had formed over these few precious days. "I need you to understand something. I'm dying." "Don't say that. Please," she interrupted, raising a hand to stop his protest. "Let me finish. I'm dying, and we both know it. The consumption is getting worse, and all this running and riding is making it happen faster." She paused to cough, and Nathan could see the effort it took for her to continue speaking. But you gave me something I thought I'd never have again. What's that? Hope, she said simply. Not hope that I'll live forever, but hope that I matter to someone. Hope that I'm worth saving, even if the saving doesn't last very long. Tears were streaming down Nathan's face now, and he made no effort to hide them. This child had endured more suffering than most adults could imagine, and yet she was comforting him, trying to ease his pain at the inevitable outcome of their journey. You matter, he managed to say. You matter more than anything. She smiled then, and for a moment Nathan could see the woman she might have become if the world had been kinder to her. Then let's make the time we have count for something. They left Willow Springs as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, taking a little-used trail that Hinrich had recommended. It would add time to their journey, but it would also help them avoid the main roads where Lucy's stepfather and his hired men might be waiting. As they rode, Lucy began to talk about her mother, sharing memories that painted a picture of a woman who had tried desperately to create a safe haven for her daughter in an increasingly dangerous world. Nathan listened to every word, committing them to memory, understanding that these stories were Lucy's most precious possessions, and that she was trusting him with her most sacred treasures. Mama used to tell me about California, she said as they paused to rest the horses beside a small creek. She said the air there was so clean, you could taste the ocean in it, and that flowers grew wild along the roads. She always said we'd go there someday, just the two of us. Maybe she knew, Nathan said. Maybe she somehow knew that you'd make that journey even if she couldn't make it with you. Lucy considered this possibility, and Nathan could see it brought her comfort. Do you think she can see us now? Do you think she knows we're trying to reach the place she dreamed about? Nathan wasn't a particularly religious man, but looking at this brave child who was facing her mortality with such grace, he found himself hoping that there was something beyond this life, some realm where loving mothers could watch over their children and find peace in knowing they were finally safe. I think she knows, he said, and I think she's proud of you. As dawn broke on what Nathan somehow knew would be their final day together, they found themselves in a valley, unlike anything he had ever seen. Wildflowers did indeed grow along the trail paintbrush, and lupine and mountain laurel, creating a tapestry of color that took his breath away. The air was cleaner here, tinged with the promise of the ocean still many miles away, and Nathan could see why this place had captured Margaret's imagination. It's beautiful, Lucy whispered, and Nathan realized that she was crying, not from pain or fear, but from joy at finally seeing the place her mother had described in such loving detail. They dismounted beside a small grove of oak trees, and Nathan spread blankets on the grass so Lucy could rest. She was coughing almost constantly now, and the blood she was bringing up had increased alarmingly. But she seemed more at peace than Nathan had ever seen her, as if arriving in this valley had fulfilled some deep need that went beyond mere physical survival. Nathan, she said, as he knelt beside her, I want you to know that these have been the best days of my life, not because of where we've been, but because of who I've been with. Lucy, let me finish, she said, reaching out to take his hand. You saved me. Not from dying, I don't think anyone could have done that. But you saved me from dying alone and unloved. You gave me the gift of mattering to someone. Nathan wanted to argue to tell her that she was going to be fine, that they would reach California and find doctors who could help her. But he could see the truth in her eyes, could hear it in the labored rhythm of her breathing. Their journey was ending here, in this beautiful valley that her mother had dreamed of, and all he could do was make sure her final hours were filled with love rather than fear. What can I do? He asked, feeling helpless in the face of forces beyond his control. Tell me about your wife, she said. Tell me about Catherine. I want to know about someone who was loved the way my mama was loved. So Nathan told her. He spoke of Catherine's laugh, which could light up any room she entered. He described the way she sang while she worked in their garden, how she could calm the most fractious horse with nothing but gentle words and patient hands. He shared memories of quiet evenings by the fire of dreams they had made together for a future that was stolen from them by the same disease that was now claiming Lucy. As he talked, Lucy's breathing grew more labored, but her eyes remained bright and focused. She was listening to every word, storing them away, like treasures. And Nathan realized that in sharing Catherine's story, he was giving Lucy something precious: the knowledge that love existed in the world, that some people were blessed to experience it fully, and that those who loved and were loved in return left something beautiful behind when they departed. "She would have liked you," Nathan said as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Catherine always had a soft spot for brave souls who refused to give up. Lucy smiled, though the effort seemed to exhaust her. Do you think she and my mama are together somewhere? Do you think they're waiting for us?" The question caught Nathan off guard, but looking at this child, who had faced unimaginable hardship with such courage, he found himself believing in possibilities he had long since dismissed. "I think they are," he said, "and I think they're proud of the journey we've made together." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that rivaled any artist's masterpiece, Lucy's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and Nathan could see the fear in her eyes as she struggled against the inevitable. "I'm scared," she whispered the first time she had admitted to such vulnerability. "I know," Nathan said, gathering her into his arms and holding her close. "But you're not alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Will you tell people about me? Will you make sure someone remembers?" "I'll tell them about the bravest girl I ever knew," Nathan promised. "I'll tell them how you faced impossible odds with dignity and grace. I'll tell them that you mattered." Lucy closed her eyes then, and for a moment Nathan thought she had slipped away. But then she spoke again, her voice barely audible, but filled with a peace he hadn't heard before. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for caring, for trying, for making me feel like I was worth saving." Those were her last words. She died as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, quietly and peacefully, surrounded by the beauty her mother had dreamed of, and held in the arms of someone who loved her. Nathan stayed with her through the night, unwilling to let her make that final journey alone. And when morning came, he buried her beneath the oak trees in ground that was soft and rich and worthy of containing such a precious soul. On her grave marker, he carved simple words that captured the essence of who she had been. "Lucy, beloved daughter, brave soul, forever remembered." Nathan never returned to Copper Creek. There was nothing there for him now except memories of injustice and the ghost of a man whose cruelty had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Instead, he bought a small piece of land in that beautiful valley where Lucy had drawn her last breath, and he built a cabin near her grave so that she would never be alone again. Years passed, and the frontier began to change around him. Towns grew larger, law and order became more than mere suggestions, and the casual violence that had defined so much of the West gradually gave way to something resembling civilization. Nathan never married again, never had children of his own, but he found purpose in other ways. Word spread about the man who lived in the valley, who would help travelers in need, and who never turned away a child who needed shelter or protection. Over the years, he helped dozens of young people escape situations similar to Lucy's, finding them safe homes and families who would love them as every child deserved to be loved. Each time he saved someone, Nathan thought of Lucy and the lesson she had taught him, that sometimes the most important victories are the smallest ones, that sometimes saving a single soul is worth more than conquering armies or accumulating wealth. She had changed his life, not through any grand gesture, but simply by allowing him to matter to her, by trusting him with her safety and her dreams. Nathan grew old in that valley, watching seasons change, and flowers bloom each spring in the meadow, where they had spent their final day together. And when his time came to leave this world behind, he faced it without fear, knowing that somewhere beyond the veil of death, a brave little girl was waiting to welcome him home, along with the wife he had loved and lost so many years before. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes forever was the sunrise painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had welcomed them to this valley all those years ago. And in that light, he could almost see them, Catherine and Lucy and Margaret standing together in a place where love conquered all darkness, where the innocent were protected, and the brave were rewarded, where every soul that had ever mattered to someone else found peace at last. His cabin still stands in that valley, tended now by others who understand the importance of remembering those who came before. And beneath the oak trees, marked by a simple stone bearing her name, Lucy rests in ground that has been watered by the tears of gratitude from all those whose lives were changed by her story. For in the end, that is perhaps the greatest gift any of us can give, not the promise of forever, but the assurance that we will be remembered, that our lives mattered to someone, that love existed and flourished even in the darkest of times. Lucy taught Nathan that truth, and he spent his remaining years passing it on to others, ensuring that her legacy lived on in every act of kindness, every moment of protection offered to the innocent, every instance where someone chose love over indifference. She was just a child, dying of consumption in a violent world that had shown her little mercy. But she changed everything for Nathan, and for countless others who needed to know that they mattered, that they were worth saving, that love was stronger than death, and more enduring than time itself. That is the story of Lucy the orphan girl who asked if her stepfather was going to put out his cigarette on her, and the cowboy who discovered that some things are worth dying for, and even more worth living for. It is a story of love, and loss of hope, and heartbreak. But most of all, it is a story of truth. Every life has value. Every soul deserves to be remembered. And sometimes the greatest courage comes in the smallest packages teaching us what it truly means to matter to someone else.